Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little, and today I am pleased and excited to bring you the reincarnation of Weekly Poker Hand, an in depth guide to poker. In the past, I did a Weekly Poker Hand podcast where I would go through a hand each week, and after about a year of that, it ended up dying off. But however, since I've just relaunched jonathanlittlepoker.com, I think it's an excellent time to go ahead and start Weekly Poker Hand back up again. You can expect a hand every week. I'm going to be posting it, and hopefully you guys enjoy it. I'm also going to make a point to get this up on iTunes and YouTube in the near future. But for the time being, you can for sure check it out on the blog here at jonathanlittlepoker.com. If you do want access to the previous 52 weeks of Weekly Poker Hand, I strongly suggest you just go to that website, weeklypokerhand.com, and there you can check out the previous 52 weeks that I produced. So in this first hand, I want to talk about getting value, which is something I constantly see players fail to do in small and middle stakes cash games. So this hand is actually not a hand that I played, but it is a hand that one of my students played, and I think that he played it about as perfectly as possible. So this hand is from a 2-5 cash game, which is, I imagine, what a lot of you listening play. And my opponent picks up, well, I have pocket jacks in the cutoff seat. We're going to assume it's me for the purposes of this video. The under the gun player limps. He's a tight passive player. The second position player also limps. He's also a tight passive player. We are playing 100 big blinds deep, so we have $500. The tight passive limps under the gun, second limps, and everyone folds around to me. So I like to raise to 25, which I think is a pretty good amount. I feel like you could perhaps make it 30 at 2-5, because a lot of people who limp are not really planning to fold to a raise. The problem is you don't want to make it like $40, because then you start forcing your opponents to fold a lot of hands that are worse than yours. And remember, whenever you're trying to get value from your hand, you want to get money in the pot and not just win a tiny pot. The goal whenever you pick up pocket jacks, like we have here in the cutoff, is not to make your opponents fold. The goal is to get full value from your hand. So we make it 25, expecting to get called. You have to realize it is okay to get called. You want to get called, because that's how you're going to get money in the pot when you're ahead. The player on the button folds, small blind folds, big blind folds, and then both the under the gun player and the second position player call and see a flop, which is not too surprising. So the flop comes 8-4-3 with no flush draw available, and both of the opponents check to me. So with pocket jacks on 8-4-3, I am more than happy to bet. I think a good bet size is probably something like 45. You can see here that I, quote unquote, my student, bet 35 into the $82 pot, which I think is probably a little bit on the small side, because if someone's going to call 35, they're probably going to call 45, and that allows you to just get more money in the pot happily. If I get check raised on this board by a tight passive player, I'm going to be somewhat sick, because I think most tight passive players plan to check call with a lot of their marginal hands and check raise with their strong hands. So against a legitimate tight passive player, I think I'm actually going to fold this if I get check raised. I know that sounds a little bit nitty, but you're going to find that most tight passive players are not check raising this flop unless they have a set or a big overpair. And I do beat tens and nines, but I also lose to slow played aces, kings, queens, and of course I lose to the eights, the fours, and the threes on 8-4-3. So whenever I do get check raised, I don't think my opponents are actually representing much, but they usually just have it. However, I do expect my opponents to call with most marginal strong made hands, and sure enough, both players do elect to call. So now the pot's $187 going to the turn, which is a 10. So first position checks, second position checks. Now it's on me again in the cutoff. And I think this is where a lot of players decide to, quote unquote, pot control, because they don't want to really risk getting blown off their hand. But I think you can very happily value bet in this spot and get money in the pot when you're in very good shape. I think you can still easily get called by marginal pairs such as nines, perhaps an 8, perhaps something like ace 10 or king 10 your opponent randomly decided to call with. So I definitely think we do need to make a value bet. And it does not need to be big, because at this point you have to understand you're trying to get called by hands worse than a 10 for the most part. And if you bet, say the pot's 187, if you bet 150, your opponents are going to fold all of their marginal hands. So you need to bet an amount that can realistically get called. And again, this is assuming our opponents are fairly weak, tight, and passive. So I ended up betting 75, and I think 75 is actually a very good size, 75 into the 187 pot. That's going to allow your opponent to easily continue in the hand with a lot of marginal junk, which is perfect because those marginal hands usually have about 5 outs at best. And like I said, if I do get check raised on the turn, I'm probably just going to fold and assume I had a set. My opponent had a set. So under the gun calls, the other guy folds. The river's a queen. So now the board is 8, 4, 3, 10, queen, which is kind of nasty, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself, is it really possible for my opponent to actually have a queen? Well, first off, Jack 9 is the nuts, and it's almost impossible for the opponent to have Jack 9, because I have 2 jacks in my hand. Could he have a queen? I mean, he could have maybe... I mean, you have to think, what hand is he going to check call the flop with and check call the turn with that contains a queen? And the answer is almost none, because tight passive players aren't limping queen 8 under the gun. They're really also not limping too many 10-8 hands. So I think that there is merit in making a small value bet on this river. Even though we no longer have an overpair because a queen's on the board, I think we pretty much have to bet. And this is a spot where in small and middle stakes cash games, very few people are making a bet, and they're leaving a pretty good amount of money on the table. I mean, you have to realize that whenever you're playing cash games, if you're good, you're going to win about 10 big blinds per hour in live cash games. So if we can make a 20 big blind bet here of only $100, we're betting 100 into 337. That's 20 big blinds we stand to win. And, you know, we are going to get called by a better hand sometimes. Sometimes our opponent's going to show us a slow play of pocket kings, or maybe a pocket threes that somehow didn't raise us on any street. So we are going to lose sometimes. But I imagine if we bet $100, we're probably going to get back $60 profit on average or something like that. I think we have the best hand quite a bit. Usually when my opponent has 9-8, 8-7, pocket 9s, maybe pocket 7s, maybe pocket 6s that decide to hero call. And you have to realize that if you do bet small, your opponent will find hero calls with these marginal made hands. It's very important that you don't bet huge. I think that's the big mistake a lot of amateur players make, is they think I need to bet big because I have what I perceive to be a good hand. And they think that on every street. And in reality, you don't want to bet big because that allows your opponent to play well. So in this hand, I think I bet 100, which I think is right around perfect. 100 into 337, that's a very good sizing that will allow you to realistically get called by numerous worse hands. And sure enough, the end of the gun player does call pocket 9s. And, you know, maybe you're thinking that there aren't too many hands the opponent can actually call with. And I don't think there are many hands the opponent can call with, but I do think pocket 9s will call, and I do think a lot of 8s will call, and maybe even smaller pairs, if you bet small and keep your opponent in the pot. So I think this was a pretty well played hand by my student. I think he could have bet a little bit bigger pre-flop and a little bit bigger on the flop. But beyond that, I think he played the hand extraordinarily well. I mean, you have to look at this. He got $250 almost, well, $235 into the pot with pocket jacks against pocket 9s, with the board are not with an overcard. I mean, it's a pretty good result. And also he did allow himself to get paid off by worse hands than pocket 9s as well. So nicely played hand by my student, and I think this is a really good educational hand, which is why I wanted to show it to you first on the reincarnated weekly poker hand. You may have noticed I'm using this program to display these hands. It's called Share My Pair. I think that it is a fantastic tool to use to display hands. You can also share hands with friends, and I post hands on here fairly often. I have around 65 hands currently on the site, and I'm putting more up all the time. So definitely check that out. If you want to share your hands with your friends, you can post them on Twitter and Facebook, and it makes it extraordinarily easy to get poker feedback. So check out Share My Pair if you have not. It's a fantastic app for iPhone, Android, etc. So definitely check back next week for Weekly Poker Hand. And if you guys have any comments, suggestions, or anything like that, definitely let me know. I'm more than happy to answer them. This has been Jonathan Little. Thank you very much for watching.